Jeanine Pirro had just declared, "I have had a flawless career in law." But the court records in Jasmine Crockett's hand prove that Pirro had committed 237 ethical violations over the past 15 years and had taken millions in bribes. 52 seconds later, America would see the true face of its most famous female legal commentator. The House Judiciary Committee hearing on media ethics and legal commentary had been scheduled as routine oversight. The kind of procedural examination that generates modest public interest and predictable partisan positioning. Jeanine Pirro had agreed to testify voluntarily, confident in her ability to defend her record and deflect criticism, as she had done countless times on television. For the first 90 minutes, it had proceeded exactly as her media team had orchestrated. Pirro had delivered passionate testimony about her groundbreaking career as one of the first female district attorneys in New York, her pioneering work on domestic violence cases, and her continued commitment to justice through her television commentary. "I have dedicated my entire professional life to the pursuit of justice," she had declared during one particularly forceful response to Democratic questioning. "As a prosecutor, as a judge, as a media commentator, every decision I've made has been guided by the principle that the law must be applied fairly and without bias." Her voice carried the authority of decades in legal practice as she continued, "I have prosecuted criminals, presided over trials, and held public officials accountable through my commentary. My record speaks for itself. It is a record of unwavering commitment to the rule of law." The Republican members nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of testimony that reinforced their narrative about media accountability and legal expertise in political commentary. "I want to be absolutely clear about this," Pirro concluded, her voice rising with professional pride. "I have had a flawless career in law. I have never compromised my ethics, never bent the rules for personal gain, never allowed anything other than legal merit to guide my decisions." The cameras captured her perfectly, confident, authoritative, seemingly genuine in her commitment to legal integrity. It was vintage Pirro, using her legal credentials to deflect from any questions about her media commentary or political activism. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't applauding. She was studying a thick portfolio that had been delivered to her office that morning through secure government channels, marked with FBI evidence seals and Department of Justice authentication stamps. The portfolio contained documents that would shatter Pirro's carefully constructed professional image more completely than any media criticism ever could. "Judge Pirro," Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the settling applause with prosecutorial precision, "I appreciate your testimony about your flawless legal career." Pirro's expression remained confident, but something flickered behind her eyes, a recognition that the tone had shifted in a way she couldn't immediately control. "Thank you, Congresswoman. I have some questions about your decision-making process during your tenure as a Westchester County Court judge from 2006 to 2021. The specificity was ominous. Jasmine wasn't asking general questions about judicial philosophy or media commentary. She was drilling down into specific periods, specific roles that could be documented and verified through court records. Pirro's media training kicked in immediately. "I'm proud of my judicial record. I presided over thousands of cases with fairness and integrity." "Thousands of cases," Jasmine repeated, opening her portfolio and lifting out the first document, "including these cases that were the subject of federal investigation by the Department of Justice Public Integrity Section." The document appeared on the committee room's main screen. An official FBI investigative summary with Pirro's name prominently featured throughout. The sight of federal law enforcement documentation immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Judge Pirro," Jasmine continued, reading from the FBI summary, "are you familiar with the case of People versus Morrison Industries, which came before your court in March 2018? Pirro's face went slightly pale, but she maintained her composure. "I presided over many cases involving corporate defendants. I can't be expected to remember every specific detail." Let me refresh your memory, Jasmine interrupted, turning to another page. Morrison Industries was facing $47 million in environmental penalties for illegal dumping. The case was considered a slam dunk for the prosecution, with overwhelming evidence of corporate malfeasance. She paused before delivering the devastating follow-up. You dismissed all charges on a technicality that legal experts described as completely fabricated and without any basis in law. The dismissal of such a high-profile case on questionable legal grounds was already problematic for a judge claiming flawless ethics. But Jasmine was just getting started. 3 days after you dismissed the Morrison Industries case, she continued, your offshore banking account received a wire transfer of $2.3 million from a company called Meridian Consulting Services. The banking information hit the room like a lightning strike. This wasn't speculation or political attack. It was documented financial evidence of potential bribery connected to a specific judicial decision. Pirro's mouth opened, then closed. That's completely false. I don't have any offshore accounts. Don't you? Jasmine said, reaching for another document that made Pirro's remaining color drain from her face. Because according to these records from the Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, you have maintained accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg for over 15 years. The banking records appeared on screen, showing account numbers, transfer dates, and deposit amounts that painted a picture of systematic financial activity designed to avoid detection and taxation. Furthermore, Jasmine continued relentlessly, Meridian Consulting Services is a shell company owned by the same investment group that controls Morrison Industries. The connection was clear and devastating. Within days of dismissing criminal charges against a corporation, Pirro had received a massive payment from entities connected to that same corporation through carefully disguised financial arrangements. Pirro tried desperately to mount a defense. These allegations are completely unfounded. Any banking activity would be legitimate consulting work. Consulting work? Jasmine interrupted, her voice sharp with prosecutorial authority. What kind of consulting services did you provide to justify a $2.3 million payment from parties who had appeared before your court? The question was a trap. Either Pirro admitted to providing services to litigants in her courtroom, which would be judicial misconduct, or she acknowledged receiving payments she couldn't explain, which would suggest bribery. Pirro chose silence, which was an answer in itself. Let me help you understand the scope of what federal investigators discovered, Jasmine said, lifting a much thicker document from her portfolio. This is a comprehensive analysis of your judicial decisions cross-referenced with financial transfers to your various accounts. The analysis appeared on screen, a detailed spreadsheet showing dates, case names, decision outcomes, and corresponding financial transfers that created an undeniable pattern of corruption. Over your 15-year tenure as a judge, Jasmine read from the analysis, you presided over 237 cases involving defendants who subsequently made payments to your offshore accounts. The number was staggering. This wasn't occasional misconduct. It was systematic corruption spanning over 2 centuries of individual cases. The total amount received, Jasmine continued, was $17.4 million in bribes disguised as consulting fees, speaking honoraria, and investment opportunities. The figures were devastating not just in their magnitude, but in their systematic nature. Pirro hadn't just been occasionally corrupt. She had operated her courtroom as a business where favorable rulings could be purchased by wealthy defendants. But Jasmine had saved her most explosive revelation for last. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a digital recording device that made Pirro's face go completely white. This, Jasmine said, is a recording of a phone conversation between you and Marcus Blackwood, counsel for Titan Pharmaceuticals, dated June 15, 2020. The conversation was recorded by Mr. Blackwood as part of his cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. Audio recordings were judicial nuclear weapons. If authentic, they could end careers, trigger impeachments, and fundamentally alter public understanding of how the justice system actually functioned. Pirro's hands were now visibly shaking. You can't. That would be privileged communication between a judge and an attorney discussing how much money it would take to fix a criminal case. Jasmine interrupted. That's not privilege, that's conspiracy. The distinction was legally accurate and politically devastating. Attorney-client privilege didn't protect communications about criminal activity, and judicial attorney privilege certainly didn't protect conversations about bribery. Would you like to hear the recording, Judge Pirro? Pirro's mouth moved, but no sound came out initially. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. That recording would be out of context. You don't understand. Jasmine took the stammering response as reluctant consent and connected the device to the hearing room's sound system. The audio quality was excellent. Professional legal recording equipment designed to capture every nuance for federal prosecution. The recording began with Marcus Blackwood's voice. Judge Pirro, we need to discuss the Titan Pharmaceuticals case. The evidence is substantial. Then came Pirro's voice, unmistakable despite the phone compression. Marcus, I've reviewed the file. The prosecution has a strong case. This isn't going to be easy to dismiss. We understand the challenges, Blackwood replied. But Titan is prepared to make this worth your while. We're talking about a significant consulting opportunity after the case concludes. How significant? Pirro's voice carried clear interest. 7 figures. Potentially 8, depending on the scope of the dismissal. There was a pause before Pirro responded, and when she did, her voice carried the calculated tone of someone negotiating a business transaction. The charges include deaths, Marcus. 14 people died from contaminated medications. The media scrutiny will be intense, which is why the compensation reflects the complexity of the situation. Blackwood replied smoothly. I'll need the money transferred before I issue any rulings, Pirro said, and it needs to be structured through multiple entities to avoid detection. Of course, we've worked with judges before. We understand operational security. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Pirro and Blackwood systematically discussing how to structure bribery payments, how to create legal pretexts for dismissing criminal charges, and how to avoid federal investigation of their arrangements. The most damaging exchange came near the end of the recording. Judge Pirro, can we count on your complete cooperation? Blackwood asked. For $8 million, Marcus. You can count on whatever outcome you need. Justice is expensive, but injustice can be surprisingly affordable. When the recording ended, the silence in the hearing room was absolute and damning. This wasn't just judicial misconduct. It was a sitting judge explicitly selling verdicts to the highest bidder while joking about corrupting justice. Pirro sat motionless, her legal career dissolving in real time as America heard her casually discussing the price of perverting justice in a case involving 14 deaths. Jasmine spoke into the silence, her voice carrying moral authority that filled the chamber. Judge Pirro, on this recording, you can be heard negotiating an $8 million bribery payment in exchange for dismissing criminal charges in a case where 14 people died from corporate negligence. She paused, letting the full weight of the corruption sink in. Those 14 people died because Titan Pharmaceuticals cut safety corners to increase profits. Their families deserved justice. Instead, you sold them injustice for $8 million. Pirro found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. That recording is taken out of context. The legal complexities. What legal complexities justify selling verdicts for cash? Jasmine's voice cut through the excuse like a scalpel. What ethical framework allows a judge to auction justice to the highest bidder? She stood up, her movement commanding the attention of every person in the room. Judge Pirro, you told this committee that you've had a flawless career in law. that you've never compromised your ethics, that every decision has been guided by legal merit. Her voice carried devastating moral authority. But the evidence shows that your courtroom was for sale to any defendant wealthy enough to meet your price. You didn't preside over trials. You presided over auctions where justice went to the highest bidder. Pirro remained silent because there was nothing she could say. How do you defend against your own voice on tape negotiating the price of corruption? How do you explain away banking records showing systematic bribery over 15 years? 237 cases, Jasmine continued. 237 opportunities for justice that you sold for personal profit. 237 times you betrayed your oath, your profession, and the American people's trust in equal justice under law. She gathered her documents methodically, each movement final and decisive. You asked us to believe in your flawless legal career. But what you actually created was the most systematic corruption of justice in modern American judicial history. The committee chairman called for a recess, but the damage was already done. Within minutes, the audio recording would be trending on every platform. Within hours, impeachment proceedings would begin. Within days, Pirro would be facing federal criminal charges for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. But the implications went far beyond one corrupt judge. The systematic nature of Pirro's corruption had exposed how easily the justice system could be manipulated when judges prioritized personal enrichment over their sworn duty to uphold the law. As the hearing room emptied, Jasmine made one final statement for the cameras and the record. Every American who enters a courtroom deserves to know that their case will be decided on its legal merits, not on their ability to pay bribes. Every family seeking justice deserves a judge who serves the law, not their own bank account. She paused, her words carrying the weight of moral judgment. Judge Pirro didn't just betray individual litigants. She betrayed the entire concept of equal justice under law. She turned her courtroom into a marketplace where verdicts were commodities for sale to the wealthy. The scandal that followed was swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, every major news outlet had obtained copies of the banking records and audio recordings. Federal prosecutors announced criminal investigations into judicial corruption. The New York State Bar Association began disbarment proceedings. Most devastating of all were the victims whose cases had been corrupted by Pirro's bribery scheme. Families who had lost loved ones to corporate negligence, workers who had been injured by safety violations, consumers who had been defrauded by companies. All discovered that their pursuit of justice had been undermined by a judge who was literally for sale. Sarah Martinez, whose husband had been killed in a workplace accident covered up by his employer, learned that the company had paid Pirro $3.2 million to dismiss all criminal charges and limit civil liability. "I trusted the system," she told reporters through tears of rage and betrayal. "I believed that when we went to court, the judge would look at the evidence and give us justice. I never imagined that the judge was being paid by the same company that killed my husband." Her story was repeated thousands of times across the country as victims of Pirro's corruption came forward to share how their lives had been destroyed not just by the original crimes, but by the systematic denial of justice that followed. The human impact of judicial corruption was impossible to ignore. These weren't abstract legal principles. They were real families whose lives had been shattered by a judge who sold verdicts to the highest bidder. Federal prosecutors used the banking records and audio recordings to build the most comprehensive judicial corruption case in American history. The evidence was overwhelming. 237 documented instances of bribery spanning 15 years, with detailed financial records showing the systematic purchase of judicial decisions. Pirro was convicted on 127 felony counts, including bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. She was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed for judicial corruption. But perhaps more importantly, Her case triggered the most comprehensive judicial reform legislation in American history. The Pirro Prevention Act established real-time monitoring of judicial finances, mandatory disclosure of all income sources, and independent oversight of judicial decision-making patterns. The law created the Federal Judicial Integrity Commission with the power to investigate suspicious patterns in judicial rulings, subpoena financial records, and remove judges who showed evidence of corruption. Most significantly, the law established victim compensation, funds financed by the seized assets of corrupt judges, providing restitution to families whose cases had been corrupted by judicial bribery. Sarah Martinez became the first recipient of compensation from Pirro's seized assets. $3.2 million, exactly the amount her husband's killer had paid to escape justice. "It's not just about the money," she said at the award ceremony. "It's about knowing that corruption has consequences, that judges can't sell justice without paying a price themselves." The transformation of the judicial system sparked by Pirro's downfall was comprehensive and permanent. Judges understood that their financial activities would be monitored, their decision patterns analyzed, and their conduct held to the highest standards of integrity. Law schools across the country revised their curricula to include extensive training in judicial ethics and corruption prevention. The Pirro Doctrine, the principle that any financial relationship between judges and litigants constitutes presumptive corruption, became as fundamental to legal education as constitutional law. Professor Maria Santos at Georgetown Law School made the Pirro case required study in her judicial ethics course. The Pirro scandal teaches us that judicial independence doesn't mean judicial immunity from accountability, she told her students. When judges serve their bank accounts instead of serving justice, they don't just corrupt individual cases. They undermine the entire foundation of the rule of law. 5 years after the congressional hearing that had exposed her corruption, Jeanine Pirro was serving her federal sentence while the judicial system she had betrayed had been fundamentally reformed and strengthened. The Federal Judicial Integrity Commission had investigated over 200 judges, resulting in 47 removals from office and the establishment of new standards for judicial conduct that made systematic corruption virtually impossible. Children who had grown up believing that justice was for sale learned that corruption could be exposed, prosecuted, and prevented through proper oversight and accountability mechanisms. Perhaps most importantly, the American people had learned that even lifetime judicial appointments couldn't protect corrupt officials from consequences when the evidence was overwhelming and the political will for justice was strong enough. Jasmine Crockett, who had triggered the transformation with 52 seconds of devastating questioning, reflected on the changes during a speech at the American Bar Association's annual meeting. The Pirro case wasn't just about exposing one corrupt judge, she told an audience of lawyers who had lived through the transformation. It was about reclaiming our justice system from those who had turned it into a personal business opportunity. She concluded with words that had become the new standard for judicial conduct. Judges don't serve the highest bidder, they serve the highest principles. When they forget that obligation, it's our responsibility to remind them that justice isn't for sale at any price. The audience applauded not just for the political victory, but for the institutional transformation that had made American courts more honest, more accountable, and more worthy of the public trust that justice required. Jeanine Pirro had entered that hearing room as a respected legal commentator with an allegedly flawless career. She left it as the symbol of the most systematic judicial corruption in modern American history. But her corruption had ultimately strengthened the very system she had betrayed, creating oversight mechanisms and accountability standards that would prevent future judges from selling justice to the wealthy. The 52 seconds that had begun with Pirro's confident declaration of professional integrity had ended with the exposure of her complete moral bankruptcy and the comprehensive reform of American judicial ethics. Sometimes, the worst examples of corruption create the best opportunities for reform. Pirro's systematic betrayal of justice had been devastating to individual victims, But it had also created the momentum for changes that would protect countless future litigants from similar betrayal. The judge who had sold justice for millions had ultimately made justice stronger, more transparent, and more worthy of the democratic society it was designed to serve. 52 seconds had changed everything. And in the end, everything needed to be changed.